Okay.
I would like to introduce our speaker, Mike Jaqua, presenting today on COVID-19 latest developments. He gave a presentation back in May about viruses and vaccines. He is a highly experienced writer who has created educational materials for many types of audiences. Mike, do you want to share a bit about your scientific background, and I'll hand it over to you.
Oh, let's see. It's about 20 years of research in the lab and then 10 years or so of writing. So kind of a long one. Research on all sorts of crazy stuff, cancer biology, immunology, animal biology, HIV research, which was my favorite because we're part of the team that discovered how to turn it from a death sentence into a treatable disease. So that's kind of like my proudest part of my career. All right. You want me to start?
Yes.
All right. Sharing screen and attempting to put it in full slideshow mode. There we go. Yeah. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Great. All right. So here we go. These are the kind of what's going on with COVID-19, because that's, kind of on people's minds at this point. So let's see what's going on with it. Let's start off with the names, which people often have an idea what it means, but frequently it's kooky. So here it is, COVID-19 itself, coronavirus, infectious disease discovered in 2019. All the stuff in red is what the abbreviation is made out of. Then you hear SARS-CoV-2, which is just like SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus number 2. Yeah. And the actual original SARS is a lot worse, which I think you'll see in a bit. All right, first I'm going to go about how viruses are typed. It's based on the type of DNA or RNA that they have. As you can see there, they can be single-stranded, double-stranded RNA or DNA. Viruses are freaking amazing at what they can use. Let's see, so talk a little bit about the types. All these different types of nucleic acid eventually have to be made into single-stranded RNA, or what's known as mRNA, and it's from that we make proteins. So real quick run through, double-stranded DNA, you can see the arrows show how they get turned into positive RNA, depending on whether it's, I should mention positive and negative. Positive sense nucleic RNA is what you can make protein from directly. Anything that's negative sense, you have to copy into the positive sense before you can make the protein. So you can see the DNA viruses are generally kind of handy because they could just be made straight into mRNA. The single-stranded DNA viruses are weird, and as you'll see in a bit, they don't cause diseases, probably because they're too weird. Double-stranded RNA can also be made straight into the mRNA. Positive RNA actually has to be copied and then copied again before it can make it. It's a little inefficient, but it works well. Negative strand RNA, very easy to use, go straight to that. And this last one's a weird one. It's single-stranded RNA, but it copies itself to DNA and then recopies itself to RNA. It sounds inefficient, but it's actually really good for mutating because that's what HIV is. And there's what COVID is. It's the positive-stranded RNA virus. Now, a few examples of all those virus types, so you get a handle on it. Double-stranded DNA is positive or negative. That's a number of things. Common cold, warts, herpes. Single-stranded DNA, nope, they don't ever make any diseases that we know of. Double-stranded RNA, you're all probably familiar with rotavirus. There's lots of old friends in this run around. The measles and the infamous Spanish flu are both negative-stranded RNA. Positive RNA, rhinoviruses, polio, and coronaviruses, and lastly, reverse transcriptase RNA, that's HIV or AIDS. Okay, it's all a bunch of technical background if you take what you want out of it. Where did COVID-19 come from? It's been a question for a lot of people. Yes, it came from China and probably went through some of the animals there, bats and pangolins and maybe pigs. Wound up in the Wuhan marketplace because Chinese eat strange things like pangolins, and that's one of the hosts that COVID can be in. And then they also have a lot of bats in caves nearby, and bats seem to be like the greatest place for a lot of viruses to hang out and mutate until they're ready to go out and hurt something. And you all remember MERS, the intermediate host for that were camels. Makes a great thing to use as a host over there in the Middle East. And just so you know, even those cute little alpacas carry coronaviruses around. Basically, almost anything can carry it around. And camels and alpacas are actually related, so it makes sense they can carry it. Okay, why haven't we seen this before? The main reason is because it's recent. It actually didn't exist much more than a decade ago. So it mutated in those bats before it got into other animals. And the reason we ran into it is because it's probably been hanging around in the jungle and caves and stuff where people used to never go. But as we keep expanding into the wilderness, we get to encounter nasty stuff like COVID. Real quick bit on the structure here. See the RNA is there inside. That's the capsid that actually protects it. Some of you have heard that it lasts for hours and hours out on a surface. That's because that thing right there has sort of a fatty layer in it. So the thing will not dry out for quite a while. And then there's those blue things, which is how the thing binds. And the fact that it binds to that ACE2 receptor is important. That's why it can get everywhere in the body and is really nasty in the lungs. And there's only one other coronavirus that binds to that, and it doesn't cause much disease. But the rarity makes this virus part of what makes it very dangerous. Lastly, the things that cause those changes can either be mutations. You see the nucleic acid on the right, and where the arrows are, you see it changed into something different. The most common way for viruses. Also do recombination, which is how COVID came about. If you look at those red and blue viruses, they get into a cell, everything kind of gets mixed and reorganized, and they come out red and blue. That's where they can pick up some gene that makes it more pathologic. That's another worry we're going to have at some point, that these mutations might render vaccines or treatments not as effective. That's exactly what HIV would do. The other coronaviruses, just so you know, and it gives you an idea of how many things this bug can infect, basically everything. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the human ones. So there's 7 of them known. These 4 we've all encountered. They cause common colds without much mortality. And then there's these 3 that we've heard of. SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, the SARS that we originally heard of, and MERS, the Middle East respiratory virus. And you see it, the lethality can be pretty high for some of these, with MERS being about 1/3 patients.
Mike,
Okay,
can
now,
I interrupt? Mike, can I
yes,
interrupt?
yes.
Galen, you have a question?
Yes. Sorry, getting back to the slide, a couple slides back about mutation and recombination. Are those changes responsible for the small number of reinfection cases we've heard about in the news?
Could be. There we go. Could be. We, the ones that I've heard of are actually base pair mutations. So what's going on in the top? The recombination, though, seems to be how this virus came from a different coronavirus that wasn't very nasty and turned into the one it is. So recombination gave it to us. Mutations change what we've got now. And like I said, the big worry is those mutations could make this thing resistant to treatments or vaccines.
Thank you, Mike.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Isn't it also possible that the apparent cases of reinfection are simply false positives because of the testing?
They could be. I haven't read anything about whether that's possible. There are a few things. The common cold can reinfect you from time to time. So maybe the same with this virus. Whether or not it's mutations, again, I haven't heard anything that says so. So,
But the difference is that the common cold, when it reinfects, is not diagnosed by, for example, the PCR test. It's diagnosed by symptoms.
exactly.
One of the key differences between that and coronavirus is that pretty much all of the cases which appear on our screens in the news media are outputs from the PCR test. They're not outputs from doctors reporting symptoms. These are mostly asymptomatic, quote, asymptomatic, unquote, cases, which means that a large number of these apparently are false positives from the test.
Actually,
right?
no.
Carry on, please.
Yeah, I'll get to tests later. I don't know that I get to, yeah, I do. I mentioned a bit about how often the false positives happen. The tests that we had months ago when everybody was scrambling to make them had some pretty crappy accuracy. The ones that we are using now, we've weeded out the crappy ones for the most part, and they generally are accurate to over 95%. And by the way, they do diagnose on symptomology, but you have to have symptoms and go to a doctor. And as you know, that's not a high percentage of people. So there's kind of a lot going on to diagnose, but the PCR tests are probably the best. Antibody tests are probably second best.
Okay.
So I'll get to more of these. And okay. Animals. Pretty much that's only a small list. There's not very many animals this thing won't infect. Assuming they're warm-blooded, it won't hit cold-blooded critters. And the diseases they cause come all the way from just a little stomach upset for the dogs down to something extremely lethal in the cats and ferrets. Okay, so now we're going to go a bit about the pathology of viruses. This is something I covered a little bit in my previous presentation, but it's always worth hearing again. Some of you weren't there. So what viruses do? Step one, they have to attach to a cell. In the case of COVID, they're attaching to that ACE2 receptor. And then once they've attached, they go into the cell like that. And once in, whatever that DNA or RNA that they have, they uncoat the virus and let that nucleic acid out. And then it basically hijacks the cell's systems for reproducing RNA or DNA. And it just makes gazillions of new virus particles until in the end, it comes out. And that's kind of the big damage, is when it starts tearing cells apart. Oh, I was going to just show this to you because I think it's cool. These are actually real electron microscopy pictures of the COVID. The little circles are it attaching to a cell with an ACE2 receptor. This is sort of a outside scanning picture of it. There are a bucket load of them coming out of one cell. And once they do that, this cell should look like the one next to it on the left, but you can see it's all bubbling off in places. That is a cell in the process of dying. So, pardon me, I'm a nerd. I think those pictures are cool. So here's how they do their long-term damage. As I said, when enough cells, those cells all get destroyed, and when enough of them get destroyed that the body can't keep up with it, that's when you start to lose function. And the two major places that COVID hits is the lungs, as you would expect. You can see the cells all bursting out of that. And those are the alveoli, which is where oxygen exchange happens. So that's, if it gets to that stage, you've got something really deadly going. It impairs your oxygen exchange, and it can also bring fluid into the lungs, so it creates something like a pneumonia. The other place where it's really bad is just in the blood vessels in general. And what it'll do is get into them. You can see sort of how that's an artery there in the middle, and it's starting to clot up, and because it's accruing so much damage, and arteries do that when there's damage, they try to clot up. But it's happening so much that, again, the body can't keep up with it. The blood vessels get leaky, they start clotting, which is kind of like what could cause a heart attack, stroke. So that gives you an idea of some of the things it does. Now we're going to get to vaccines, which is something we're all concerned about. I'm just real quick going to go through this. You probably all read this in the news. They first find the candidates by doing tests in the lab on mice, cell cultures. Once they've got that done, they go into clinical trials, which now everybody's learning about this. Used to be hardly anybody knew. So you've heard about the phase 1 trials. Those are very small with just a dozen or so people. And it's designed to see if the vaccine is safe and to determine the right dose of it to use. And they do get a little bit of response information here. Phase 2, more people. This is kind of like more of the same from phase 1, but now they're looking for the vaccine to be effective a lot more. If it gets through this, it goes to the big, huge phase 3 trials. In the case of COVID vaccines, they're enrolling about 30,000 people per trial, which is a ridiculous number most of the time. And these phase 3 trials are the ones that take a lot of time. They're trying to coordinate them so they go through faster. Instead of staggering the people that they sign up, they're trying to get as many people as they can signed up right away. So it gets them a lot of data back sooner. There's some issues about protection. There's a lot people don't get with this. One of the things about protecting yourself from COVID is it's not just you're protecting everybody. And you've heard about this stuff being pretty infectious. This is what they call the R0. It's basically the infectious ratio. And in the case of an average of 5.7 for COVID, it means if one person has the bug, that person can infect 5 or 6 people within a day to a week. So as you can see, 5 or 6 people just from those 2 guys that were jogging. And by the very next iteration, looks like the whole neighborhood's infected. And I put this last bit in just to get an idea of the mathematics of this. If you start off with 1 person and you multiply it by 5 every time, you do that 12 times, and you've got basically almost the whole population of the United States infected. This is what would happen if we did nothing at all. fortunately, we're doing something. A lot of people want to know about who's in danger from this. Isn't it just all the old folks? Not really. You can see that it does get worse with percentage of deaths by age, but you can see that even the 0 to 17-year-olds are getting a small amount. And while that's just a few, multiply it by 200 or 300 million, and that number gets significant. And this gives you an idea of how much those underlying conditions count. You'd see that those with underlying conditions, I mean, look at the numbers, you know, there's 2 deaths without it, 5,000 deaths with it. It's pretty significant. Something that's worth understanding is that this data that I have right here is from New York City alone about in May. And that was when they were in their really horrid shape and we were all hearing about it. Since then, there's been a lot more spread, and the numbers you're going to see here is for the whole country, about a month ago. We got 175,000 deaths as of the time I made this slide set. So it's done a pretty good job in a few months, despite us trying to stop it. Now about some of the things that we use to stop it. Masks, some people wonder how much they help. Even the cloth ones have a tremendous amount of effect. But people who don't think they work, you know, it's like ask a doctor, nurse, a lab worker, whoever, they do work very well. The only people who don't think so are generally people who listen to Fox News and right-wing radio. It's interesting, some of the people who don't believe it, I've actually heard them reject the germ theory of disease, the idea that viruses, bacteria, those sorts of things cause disease. What bugs me is that even primitive people have worked this out, and you can see them holding cloths or masks over their mouth when they know there's a sickness in the village. Not all primitive people do this, but there are ones who figured it out. Social distancing. You ever notice how we all reflexively move away when you hear somebody coughing in the supermarket or something? We do that because we realize we can get infected by a cloud of viruses coming out of their mouth. I want to point out there's a lot of ways about keeping social distances. We've got the little dots that all the restaurants have. I think we've all kind of learned to do it. At all costs, there's always alternative ways. I like anti-social distancing. And again, this is another one primitive people have often worked out. They will isolate people in, you know, houses or whatever they have. I put this in to indicate scientifically what masks and distance do. And you can see on the left, you've got masks, and they're pretty much always blank or very few cultures of bacteria or virus. On the right, you've got somebody wearing no mask at all, but they keep increasing the social distance. By the time you get to 6 feet, you can see it only had one bacteria or viral colony showing infection. So both mask and social distancing really do work. And lastly, isolation, does it really help? Yes, that's why they isolate people in the hospitals so that they don't get everybody infected. Schools and workplaces, even in normal times, tell you don't come if you're sick. We know that isolation works. And again, primitive people have worked this out. What's going on here is that I've got somebody isolated in that little hut, and the boy is standing outside knowing that it's not safe. Some other things about all this stuff, especially the isolation. So remember to take care of each other. You can just make a phone call. You don't have to go there and risk anything. So take care of each other. And if you're one of those introverts like me who's perfectly happy being isolated, Put your book down and call your extrovert friends. They're the ones who are hurting in this situation. Everybody's heard about flattening the curve. And the reason, amongst the many reasons we want to flatten it reduces the load on the healthcare system. You don't put so many in at once. It also gives us fewer deaths and cases while we spend time working on that vaccine. And as I showed you earlier, if we had done nothing at all, we might have the entire country infected by now. But because we've saved a lot of load on the healthcare system, and we've got time to work on that virus. Not a bucket load of time. And, I said this is effective. You all know how much trouble the U.S. has had compared to the rest of the world. Very disorganized, isolation, mask, that sort of thing. So, because of that, compared to the rest of the world, we suck like the intake of a wind tunnel. An idea, we have about 25, a quarter of all the world's cases. We have about a quarter of all the world's deaths. We have 4% of the world's population. So we suck. Or I could say, we're number one. But that's just a quick rundown of the data back on September 16th, so pretty recent. We've got 4.2% of the world's population, 23% of their cases, almost a third of active cases, and a bit over a fifth, almost a quarter of deaths. So we're not doing that well, especially in a highly advanced country.
Can I interrupt you, Mike?
Yes, ma'am.
Galen, you have a question?
Yes, please. Mike, looking at the data from Worldometer, which I'm curious if you consider that accurate or not, it shows that we have current cases in Colorado about 33,500, whereas we had about a third of that number at the end of April when we were under lockdown, or I think we're still under lockdown. Is it correct to say that it's therefore roughly 3 times as dangerous to be out and around now as it was when we were under lockdown in late April? Or are there differences in the infectiousness and the severity of the virus that make it actually disproportionately more or disproportionately less dangerous to be out and around than it was in April?
There are more people infected now, so you have a better chance of running into somebody who, can pass that virus.
Certainly, clearly.
Yep, and that's one element. The other one is that we've all heard about, mostly the red states, having these big flare-ups. Well, then you got some people from Texas who decide that they're still going to take a vacation in Colorado. And that was one of the big concerns that our governor had when we started hearing about these flare-ups. Like, there's no way for me to close off Colorado. So we just have to deal with more people coming into the state who are infectious, in addition to having just more people on average. Does that answer you?
Yes, I wasn't thinking so much about people bringing it in, but just wanted to get see if my assumption was basically right, that it's kind of 3 times as dangerous because there are 3 times as many people carrying it as there were in April, and that 3 times factor would not need to be thought of as adjusted up or down because, maybe, for example, yeah, there are 3 times as many people have it, but it's 1/3 as infectious. So you could say that net, it's the same amount of risk going out walking around. But what I think I understand is that it's basically 3 times as dangerous to be out walking around now as it was in April in terms of exposure to other people.
Yes, you're right. In terms of exposure, that's exactly the problem.
Thank you.
Can I comment on that, please?
Yes.
I think that's a total misrepresentation. The case count in every place in America is not determined by the number of people who actually have symptoms. It's determined entirely by testing. If you look at the numbers of people who are being tested now, as opposed to the number of people who are being tested back in April, We are testing far more than 3 times as many people every day now than we were testing in April.
Good point,
So
Martin.
to compare the testing results and saying that the virus is now more dangerous than it was in the past is a complete misrepresentation. The second thing is that if you look at the death rate in Colorado, the charts of the death rate show that it peaked sometime in, I can't remember exactly when, April or May,
Yes.
and then it came down and it stayed down. It is practically zero, and it has been zero for several weeks, if not months.
You're
The
talking
actual
about,
hazard from coronavirus in Colorado at this point is very, very, very small. You are more likely to be killed in a car accident on your way home from work.
yeah, and you were talking, when you were talking about the zero death rate, that's Colorado that you meant, right?
Well, yes,
Yes.
it has dropped off. It has dropped off everywhere in America. If you look at the death rate for America as a whole, that also has dropped off. And incidentally,
Yes.
a large part of the reason for that is because a large part of the initial death rate was caused by people in their 80s and 90s who were dying in care homes. Part of the reason why they were dying in care homes was that people were being discharged from hospitals and then put into care homes where they sadly infected the people in the care homes, and so the death rate in the care homes went sky high.
Yep.
Well,
Yeah,
those people have now
can you
died, so the death
Martin,
rate
can
has
you
dropped
let
off
Mike,
again.
Martin, can you give Mike a chance to respond, please?
Please.
Yes. No, what you said is largely right. One of the things you'll notice if you look at the data nationally is, yes, more testing can give us more positives, but you'll also see that the increase of the testing is something like, I think it's increased something like 8 times, but the increase in the cases have increased far more. So clearly we are still getting more cases as, a percentage of the population. But yes, you're right, we are detecting more as well. As for the death rate, the biggest reason for the death rate coming down is that we have learned to basically isolate people as quickly as possible and also to take care of ourselves. And that's going to bring that death rate as well as the case rate down. And Galen was right. My data is from Worldometer. And if you look at the curve for the United States, yes, it peaks some months ago, and it has been coming down with occasional flare-ups. And most of that is due to the fact that we've figured out how to isolate. We've got the message out to people. And if you go out in society today, you're going to see a lot of people with masks, people generally trying to stay away from each other. So that is part of it too. And it is multifactorial as well. So there's that too, Martin. And
Could
you
I-
seem to be doing
Mike,
a
can
pretty
I-
good. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Jim, did you want to ask your question? You put a question in the chat box about aerosols.
I thought you would read it. So,
Yes, I will, unless you want to. Although aerosols is the most direct
So-
vector for infection, what do we know about contact surface transmission risks? For example, surfaces in grocery stores.
Yep, it's a good question. A good way to think of this is kind of like the common cold. We're all pretty familiar with aerosols, but we also know people need to wash their hands. We also know if somebody sneezes near a table, it's not a good idea to go over there and lean on the table or sit down and eat there. The highest risk is going to be the aerosols, because when somebody coughs, they're spewing out bazillions of virus particles. When you go over and touch a table, you're getting maybe, thousands, possibly a million or so, not nearly as much. So the risk is worse for aerosolized viruses and somewhat less for viruses on surface. I think that answers your question.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions, Mike, but I don't want to bog you down just now. Do you want to take a couple more questions or move on?
How about we move on, and then I know we're going to have questions when I'm done. So
Okay.
you, wherever those questions are, if they can just write them or whatever, and we'll get to them a little later.
Okay.
Or maybe there'll be a slide later they fit with. Okay, so how's Colorado doing? We're okay, average-ish. If you look over at the rankings, you'll see that for cases, we're about right in the middle, number 30 out of 70. And for deaths, 24 out of 70. And there's a little note down there. No, we don't have 70 states, but when you put states, territories, military bases, and so on, they, the people who broke it down for this had 70 different regions to talk about. Okay, testing. I know a lot of people have this on their minds. So what we generally know is that the serum tests are used to see if you have the antibodies to the virus, and that tells you if you have had COVID-19 at some point. The swab tests are generally used, these are generally the PCR tests, and they're used to see if you currently have the virus. One of the problems with this is that you will only have the virus for a week or two in your system, so this only gives current infections. They have worked out now a swab or saliva test that can actually detect the antibodies. So it's kind of nice. They can take a couple of saliva examples or samples and go do the test, and they don't have to go do the more time-consuming serum tests. The serum tests are still a little more accurate, though. This is about accuracy right here. So I know a lot of, I know Martin was asking about it earlier. First thing to know about testing is a thing called sensitivity. That is the ability of a test to detect a case that is positive versus a false positive or simply missing a case. So what you can see here is that little square that I had popped up in blue. We're saying we've got 10 people, we've sampled them, and it detected 7 cases out of 8 actual cases. So if you did that, you've got an 87.5% sensitivity. Specificity is the other thing that is important in understanding how good a test is. That's the ability of your assay to detect or distinguish between a positive and negative case. So the first one, sensitivity, you may miss cases entirely. Those are generally false negatives. Specificity would be getting a wrong result. You find somebody who's positive, they're not. You test somebody negative, but they should have been positive. And again, looking at the little situation I've set up here, basically the test in this case got 8 out of 10 right. So that's an 80% specificity. So if you've got a really good test, it should have sensitivity and specificity in excess of 90%. And that's sort of, for most tests, over 90% is pretty much the threshold that you would like to cross. If you're below it, you should really put a little more work into improving your test.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Looking at that chart, some of the boxes are not filled. What is the status of the people who are in those boxes? If negative means that no, you don't have coronavirus, and positive means that you do have at least the fragments of coronavirus floating around inside you, they don't actually, I believe, say whether you actually have an active coronavirus infection or whether you're infectious. They just say you have fragments floating around inside you which appear to come from coronavirus. What is the status of the people who aren't checked in those boxes?
Good question. First off, if they detect the coronavirus as being in you, it means you have a current infection, and there's only about a 2-week window to
Wait a
find
sec,
that.
doesn't the PCR test also detect fragments of the coronavirus?
No, it does not. You have to have the active RNA
I'm sorry,
in them.
you're wrong about this. I've read a lot of articles about the PCR test, and the way it works is that it detects fragments of the virus and then it multiplies those.
You're thinking
through-
of you're thinking of the RNA as a fragment.
I'm
When you
thinking of
say
the way the
fragment-
PCR test works. The
Okay,
PCR
I'd like
test
to suggest the suspension of this topic. Let's leave this towards the end. I really
right.
want to give Mike a chance to move through his presentation.
Okay.
And I'm happy to discuss that further. Let's see. Okay, how good are the tests currently in use? It varies. But the ones that are currently in use are over 90%. Most are over 90%. And the last time I was looking at it, most of the ones that are in use out there continuously actually have sensitivities and specificities that are over 99%. So earlier, we used to have some really sucky ones that were getting down to 60%. Nobody liked those, and they were kind of phased out, so that we now have all the ones that have a high rate of accuracy. And if you are going to get tested yourself, your best bet is to go get, I say, the swab and serum test, get the PCR test, which tells you if you have an active infection, and also get the antibody test, which tells you if you have been infected already. So if you get a positive test that you have the virus, you really want to isolate yourself and not go out in public for a couple weeks. You've all heard about that 2-week isolation. If you've got antibodies but no virus, you're pretty safe. You're not going to infect anybody. Okay, now some of the elements around immunity. Everybody's heard about herd immunity. And herd immunity is when a large portion of the community has had the virus, they are now immune, and that makes the spread unlikely or very slow. And you can get this by natural infection or vaccination. In the case of a virus like COVID, you don't really want to do it by letting everybody get infected. So this is just a quick look at how herd immunity works. You can see this is the early stage of the disease. You don't have very many people who are immune. So just a couple of people who've got it, that's the people in red, will spread it all over the place. A little bit later, when you start getting the people in yellow who are immune, the people in blue who aren't, and the people in red who are infectious, you still get a lot of people infected. What you really want is this case. Almost everybody is gold, which means they're immune. So a couple of guys who are infectious don't have a big effect. And that is when you've got herd immunity in place. By and large, we have herd immunity for something like the measles is a good example. So how long does it take to develop herd immunity? As you might imagine, it depends on the particular organism and specifically on the R0, the infectious ratio that I mentioned earlier, and also on the persistence of immunity. It's one of the problems with the common cold. You can try a vaccine, but the immunity just doesn't seem to last. So here's something about the R0s of COVID. I put the R0 here as all the way from 2 to 6. You have seen that I've seen that in the reports, but more lately they're managing to settle out the R0 is up around a bit over 5. The ordinary seasonal flu, I was surprised to see that its infectious ratio is somewhat less than this virus. And the measles is ridiculously infectious. that's got a 12 to 18 are not. So then you imagine if one person has it, they're going to infect a dozen to a dozen and a half people. So with COVID-19, how long would herd immunity take? We figure about 200,000 people would need to be infected and immune. And if you do 5% on that, that's 10 million deaths. I don't think that's acceptable. So now we're going to talk about something that's worried everybody. Oh, I'm sorry. This is from my previous presentation. I'm just going through it real quick. If you get infection initially, you're going to generate antibodies primarily, and that's one of the fastest ways to respond to the virus. And the antibodies tend to persist for some months. We also get T cells activated, and they're the ones that attack infected cells. So basically, the antibodies will tend to stop infection. The T cells will work to clean up an infection. And then the long-term memory that you've heard people talk about, the long-term immunity from the virus, in this case appears to reside in the T cells. We know it's that way with the original SARS virus, and by all we've found so far, the SARS-CoV-2 works pretty much like it does in terms of immunity, but not entirely. Or we don't know. You know, it's still, what are we at, 9 months? It's not long for a lot of research to be done. Okay, here's what we've got with immunity. If you get infected with COVID-19, one thing we're not sure about is how much long-term immunity we get. That's the biggest issue with the vaccines. And I think my bet would be that we're probably going to need regular boosters to this vaccine. The other thing is there any cross-reactivity between other coronaviruses that might help us a bit with COVID-19? And the answer to that is we're not 100% certain, but we really don't think so. So you can't get the common cold and thereafter be immune to COVID-19. Okay, vaccines. One of the notable things about vaccines is there are no vaccines to any coronavirus. The original SARS and MERS both kind of got contained, and we didn't need to develop one as fast. And the common cold, nobody's really trying to vaccinate against it. So no, there's no viruses to coronaviruses. So that brings the question, how long will it take us to develop a vaccine, since we've never done one before? We don't know yet, but the process is moving so freaking fast that I can't think of anything that's gone this fast before. They do develop, oops, hang on a minute, I got a phone somewhere that's, I can't find my phone and it's ringing over here. And I'm just going to leave it. Okay, the only place where I've seen vaccines develop really fast is the annual flu vaccines, but that's a really different situation, which I won't go into. Normally, the vaccine development requires multiple steps. Each one can take varying amounts of time. But for COVID-19, we've accelerated this all to an insane degree. And that's why you frequently hear about something called Operation Warp Speed. They're just trying to increase the speed at which this virus, at which we develop the vaccine for this virus. Whoops, hang on a minute. My earplug fell out. Oh. Sorry, I'm going to turn that alarm off. The reason I couldn't find my phone was it fell in the trash can. It's always a good place for it. All right.
It's all good, Mike. We're still here.
That's okay. Packet operation warp speed, they've called it that because it really is freaking fast. Going to give you an idea here of how much warp speed is taken off. You can see here, this is a somewhat normal timeline for developing a vaccine. And you can see this one runs about 4 years. A lot of them take 2-3 times that long to develop a vaccine. We're trying to do it in less than a year. So this activation of warp speed has really worked. You can see how much it's compressed the timeline and how much of a Star Trek nerd I am. So what about the vaccines that are out there? There are more than 150 of them that people are working. They work by a number of ways. I'll show a little more about this in just a minute. There are vaccines that use RNA to create the response. It's a pretty good idea, really, because you can reproduce almost all the proteins of the virus using RNA. There's some that use DNA in the same way. A lot of them are using a modified virus. Basically, it's a virus that cannot infect you because some of the infectious elements have been removed. So it's kind of like a live attenuated vaccine. And then one of the other methods is by actually injecting people with pre-made proteins from the virus. And then the question we all have is what's going to be available first? And currently the front runner in this race is the modified virus. They're expecting to have the early data analysis in April of 2021. So this basically means they're going to go from discovery to early approval in just over a year. Again, it's an insane speed. Just going to go real quickly through how some of these viruses work. We've got the DNA viruses, which will take the DNA into the nucleus of the cell and start replicating it and start producing the proteins from that. I mentioned the RNA viruses, RNA treatments. They essentially work the same. They go into the cell, and I should have had that arrow go into the nucleus because they'll be copied there. And then they start making proteins very rapidly. The proteins that are being released are straight down from that box the arrows are pointing at. You can see them coming out of the cell. What happened? Oh, okay. Then you've got the actual infection by modified or killed viruses. Those go in, the immune system can start reacting to them right away without any need to translate nucleic acid into proteins. So it's a very efficient way, and it is the most common way that we make vaccines today. And so once you've got them, what you want to produce early on are antibodies, which are kind of those little green things. And that, once you've got those circulating in your body, they will stop infection, which is what that's showing right there. Hopefully they'll stop it and we can get rid of this virus. The development for treatments. Again, are there any treatments for any coronaviruses? The answer is not treatments specifically made for coronaviruses, but ones that we can borrow. Everybody's heard about remdesivir. That's one of them. There's also a number of other things that we're trying and modifying a bit. RNA polymerase inhibitors will stop the virus from replicating its RNA. Nucleotide analogs that basically do the same thing, but just in a different way. These ones will stop the virus from being able to unwind any DNA or RNA. Again, stops replication. And then we've got monoclonal antibodies that you've heard about, which if we develop these quickly enough, we can basically have sort of a stopgap treatment until we get the vaccine made. And lastly, and not the ones I'm very keen on, are immunosuppressants that will stop inflammation. Some of you may have heard about the cytokine storm. That is when your immune cells start producing, over there in the picture you see release of cytokines. It will release those proteins, and those will have effect on other cells, and basically they will turn on the inflammatory system so fast and so system-wide that you can get somebody killed by a cytokine storm in an hour if it's really bad. So it's not a bad idea to stop those if you think they're going to happen. And we're still working on more. It's given us a great incentive. I think this crisis is actually going to leave us with more antiviral treatments than we've had before. Okay, this is, again, treatment development, just like the vaccine development had the Operation Warp Speed. They're doing it with treatments too. They're shortening all the clinical trials, shortening the approval phases, coordinating every step so that they can move rapidly. So funding it through the FDA. It's a special emergency program. They've hired a bucket load of people to help with it too. And you know, the main thing they want to know right away is, are they helpful or harmful? Once they've done that, they're going to pretty much go into phase 3 trials, which the FDA supports. Right now, the sort of the mission statement on is use every available method to develop new treatments as quickly as possible. I'm going to show you a picture of a doctor who's famous for developing new treatments as quickly as possible. That guy. So we'll use every method available, and if it's him, great. And then the optional stage 2, if things get even worse, this guy will kick into warp speed too. Now, one of the questions for the future is there going to be another pandemic? Answer is most likely, but what the bug will be and where it will come from, there's no way we can know that. There's way too many variables. But the major news is that if it's not a coronavirus, it'll be something else that will be coming back to us, even though we don't like it. Sort of a look at before, epidemiologists have been warning us for almost 10 years that we were going to have a huge pandemic, and everybody ignored them. Now we wish we'd listened. So those same epidemiologists are now saying that within the next few decades, we are likely to see other pandemics, singular or multiple. So brace yourself, people. Don't throw your masks away. One of the good things, though, is we can predict reasonably well, because of the knowledge we've got, the kind of recent or increased frequency of the epidemics. That means we can prepare for them. We can put the emergency disease response teams that Trump disbanded back in place. So hopefully next time something like this happens, maybe we won't all have to sit in our rooms and talk to each other solely by telephone or computer. Right now, however, and this is a really thing that makes me angry, public health is historically underfunded. And I'm really hoping that, again, this whole thing will give us the impetus to start funding that. Okay. Again, the future, the odds are that some virus will cause an outbreak, but which particular virus and where are going to depend on which specific bug is the culprit. You can see the different kinds again. So who knows, could be a new hepatitis virus. It also depends on which animals act as hosts. If llamas act as hosts or pangolins, you know, that's going to start a pandemic in a certain place and give us a target for where to really concentrate on containing it. Which people are likely to contract the disease? makes a difference as to how we work on it. Right now, it's old people, so we want to protect them especially. It's worth noting that the Spanish flu back in 1918 actually had its highest mortality rate in people in their 20s and 30s. Why? I'm not sure, but it did.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
because in the 1880s, there was an outbreak of the H1N1 influenza that ripped through the West. And so you had people that in 1918 were then in their 50s, 60s, who already had some exposure to that virus. People that were in their 20s and 30s had no immunity whatsoever. Plus, it was a more lethal strain of the influenza. So that explains a lot. And that's from a Stanford lecture that I did get to see. So it's pretty, I'll find the link for that and post that in the comments.
Great, that's cool. That's actually, I didn't know that bit of history. So now we've got some explanation. Also, just
yeah, I'm a doctor.
What's that?
But I've been hunting this thing down as I'm a data scientist. You know, I'm working on building a contact tracing algorithm with Dr. Samet at Colorado School of Public Health. So I try to keep my politics out of this and just say, okay, let's just focus on, let's find it. Where did we see that? Okay, now everybody that, you know, came into contact with this individual in the last 72 hours, let's give them a call. I hope that has been part of why Colorado is one of the least affected states.
Ryan, can I interrupt you real quick?
Yeah.
Mike, I'd like you to finish your presentation, and then I'm going to kind of control the discussion afterwards. And Ryan,
Okay.
you will be first on the list because I know you have you've been trying to get in. So I will make you first on the list.
That's okay. Thanks.
All right, so just going through the effects of what will cause pandemics, the area, the environment, the people, what kind of hosts are there. Kind of that perfect storm was what got COVID-19 out of the jungles and into every place else. And another thing that's really important is environmental changes caused by humans. You've all heard about destruction of forests. That as we do more of that and we get further into the jungle, we're going to start to hit things we've never seen before. And a lot of people think that that's exactly what happened with COVID-19. Then again, there's all sorts of other variables, and right now nobody's been able to develop a computer program or algorithm that can take all of these variables into account to predict, you know, sort of the timing and origin of the next pandemic. Which is what just to give you an idea of the candidates that are out there that have caused epidemics or pandemics in the past. We've got all the larger single-celled organisms. Up there, you can see the what those organisms are, and think of the old friends that have infected various parts of humanity time and again. There's also a lot of viruses that have infected us over the years. There are a lot of, I'm sorry, the one above was, where did that go? Bacteria, not viruses. Here are viruses that have affected us through the years. And this is just a sample of all the bugs that are out there that could potentially cause an epidemic or a pandemic. And this last guy down in the corner that I have, some of you may have heard of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It's basically a brain disease, and it will very rapidly turn a brain into cottage cheese. But it's made by a thing that is only a protein, no RNA or DNA, no complex structure of any kind. So biologists are still trying to figure this guy out. He is weird. So here's some of what we can learn from all this. We've got experience from this, which we hope will be maintained so that we're better prepared in the future. One of the problems is that we've got people who are not wearing masks. And that guy at the top is Woodrow Wilson. During the Spanish flu, he and everybody around him basically did not wear masks. And in fact, at times Wilson actually ordered them not to. So in the current situation, we've got people not wearing masks, but at least thank goodness they're not telling the people around them that they can't wear. Another thing is the standing orders for masks and distancing. A lot of places didn't have that back then, and they don't have it now. That picture is a cop arresting a man who did violate a mask law. He wouldn't wear the mask. A lot of people that have gone to work and church and so forth in the middle of this pandemic, just like they did back with the Spanish flu. I think we're learning to avoid that. And then we've got cities that tried to open too soon. We've already heard about cities and states here that tried to do it. Back in 1918 in San Francisco, they decided to have a big old World War I victory parade. And after this parade, they had an absolutely gigantic uptick in cases and deaths. So hopefully the next time it comes, we'll have leaders that can do it. Yes, I know that this looks like politics, but honestly, this guy fucked up. So did this guy. If he had done what his advisors were telling him, we wouldn't have had the millions and millions of people dead who perished in that old pandemic. Just a little bit about how things were similar back then. They did figure out masks. It wasn't very difficult. They had people all over wearing them. For some reason, they didn't enact the social distancing thing. Sports games, churches, everything just kept going pretty much as before. So this is another precaution that they didn't take that could have helped a lot. So here's just a quick set of lessons we were supposed to learn from 1918 that we didn't. This is from a rather sizable article called Deja Flu, Forgotten Lessons from the 1918 Pandemic. This person, Rosalie, can't remember, I think it's Edith Rosalie. She's actually working on a book talking about all this too, I understand. So that could be very interesting. One of the greatest lessons we learned, it's in bold print there, tell the truth. Back then, Woodrow Wilson was literally lying to the people. Again, tell the truth. If you do that, we might have more people live. And then from 1918 to 1920, just to show what doing the same stupid stuff, how stupid stuff lives on and on. Reports back then described the flu, the 1918 flu, as just like the seasonal flu by another name. And the government under Wilson ensured people that there was no occasion for panic because this flu had a lower fatality rate than anything they've been hearing. And you can, you hear reports now, they're saying the same thing. So sometimes we learn, sometimes we don't. This is just a statement of summary of Woodrow Wilson's duties. He utterly failed in his duties, abdicated them, failed to lead, strategize, plan, or be honest with the public. That's a huge part of what caused millions and millions of deaths. So again, did we learn from this? I hope so. Maybe, kind of. But there are some people who will never learn. I'm telling you a little story here. In 1918, a successful 49-year-old businessman, husband and father of 3, was living in Queens. One day in May, he came home from work not feeling well. He died within a day or two. He was a victim of the first wave of the Spanish flu pandemic. Interesting thing is, We know this guy indirectly today. Here's who he is. Donald Trump's own grandfather. And this is just a quick look at historical pandemics. Way down in the right-hand lower corner, you can see COVID-19, and the size of that dot is getting to be fairly large. We've got a ways to go before we catch up with, the Spanish flu or something, but that dot, when I first made this slide set, and I started some of this months ago, that dot, when I first put it in there, was like a pencil point. Now it's pretty easy to see. So we are suffering somewhat. If anybody wants some of the references, I'll be happy to share. So, ta-da,
Thank
we're
you,
done.
Mike. If you
We
can
stop
go
the
ahead
share.
and stop screen sharing, and that way we can see each other.
Very
And
good.
so I would like to just set a few ground rules for the discussion. I'll call on several people that I know have questions, and if you could just keep it to the most important question out of all the questions maybe that you have had, and so we can get through, get it to other people to ask questions. And if it gets to be a bit lengthy, I apologize in advance, but I'll kind of cut you off just so we can get everybody a chance to ask questions. So Ryan, I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, so I'm about to post in the comments here, the link to a talk. It wasn't Stanford that I saw, that was another one, but this is at the University of Arizona, spring of 2013. Here's the genesis of the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic. And here is the link for that, right? You all want to just copy and paste that over into a Word doc. It is an hour and 8 minutes, but absolutely worth your time in getting information about, the comparisons between the 1918 flu. Yes, absolutely. The 1918 H1N1 influenza was more lethal in the 20 to 30 age group than in any other. 20 and 30-year-olds, remember, had just gotten a massive exposure from primarily the males over in the trenches in World War I. So you get out into an area where you don't get adequate sunlight, you don't get adequate nutrition, you have a great deal of stress because, I'm going to tell you, as a soldier, 17 years, there are very few things more stressful than bullets coming at you. Or, coming home in the evening to find out that one of your buddies got hit with a rocket-propelled grenade. That's very stressful. They came with their with their battle stress, were infected with the H1N1 either over there or over here, because the sad truth of the H1N1 influenza is that it more likely started on a pig farm in Indiana. That's where the H1N1 influenza strain that was so lethal in 1918 came from. Now, about the issue of masks, I am not an anti-masker. Let's get that straight. I am not a Trumpist. Jesus, people, I am not a Trumpist. I am a classic definition of a liberal. If you go read Adam Smith's work, Wealth of Nations, that describes me to a T. Okay. Because someone says, hey, this little mask right here, I got it in my pocket, I think. Okay. Now I've got the N95 mask, finally. There were a whole lot of fake N95 masks available out there, but this right here, it's t-shirt material. Okay.
Okay, 30 more seconds, Ryan.
Okay, 30 seconds. I put in the quote. I put in the comments there. 450 micrometers between individual strands of the fiber in there. That's millionths of a meter. The coronavirus virion, 125 uh, nanometers. So what you're thinking, if you do the math, 450 micrometers and 125 nanometers is that 37,500 virions can stand side by side, just sail straight through that. And, you know, please, let's all remember that we're on the same team. I absolutely think that we're doing better and that we can yet still do better, and we just keep the politics out of it. Thank you. I yield the balance of my time.
Mike, would you like to respond?
Yeah, there's just a couple quick things with the younger people getting the Spanish flu back then. Everything you mentioned is right. Somebody mentioned the vaccines from about 40 years previous, which I hadn't heard about. Yeah, that's right. The other thing with young people, sometimes you'll get a bug that does bother them a bit more than older people. And the theory on that is that younger immune systems are actually more vigorous. And that bit I showed about the cytokine storm, if you're young with a vigorous immune system and something wants to trigger that as kind of part of its pathology, it's very apt to hurt you more than people with more quiescent immune systems. And then real quick about masks, if you've got single layer masks like a t-shirt, they help, but yeah, not going to help as much. One of the interesting things is that as your breath moistens the mask, that's something that the virus can attach to. And if you go out and buy most of the masks these days that you can get in stores, I just have mine right here, you can see it's 2-layer. That will help a bit more too, because, you know, if the virus gets through one, they might be held up by the other. And again, the more I breathe in this and moisten it, the more it kind of tends to make the virus stick to it. So it does help. And you saw the that picture I put with how the mask versus no mask worked. If I recall correctly, that was actually using cloth masks.
Okay.
Okay, I'd like to get to another person. Galen,
Okay.
did you have any questions?
Nope, no further. Thank you very much, though.
Okay, the next person I have on the list, Martin.
I don't think I got an answer to my earlier question about what was the status of the people who, in that chart which you showed, who did not have a check mark in either of the two columns. But I would like to make a few general comments here. The first is that, and please try not to take this as insulting, because I don't mean to be insulting, but having read a very, very large number of articles on coronavirus from a very large number of sources, including international sources, since actually beginning before February, I have to say that your presentation sounded to me like a regurgitation of the material that the pharma companies are putting out before the American public through the mainstream media. And the media, as you may have noticed, is increasingly censoring things which tend to criticize the orthodox view of coronavirus, places like Twitter and Facebook. And so essentially the American public is largely getting only one perspective, which is the perspective of the pharma companies. And of course, their major interest is to sell their vaccines. They don't give a rat's ass about whether or not you die of coronavirus.
Martin, can I interrupt you? Mike,
Yes.
Can I give you a chance to respond?
What you refer to as what the orthodox view, that comes from people who actually work on these things. They're in labs. Pharma companies have bucket loads of real scientists who really work in labs. I used to be one. And so what you call the orthodox view is the scientific. Masks work. The virus has the type of infectivity it does. It works through the receptors it does. It has the pathology we described, social distancing, all these things. that doesn't come from Twitter or Facebook or Wikipedia. That comes from people in laboratories who work with viruses, who wear masks. Some of them work with some pretty nasty diseases. In my case, I worked with AIDS for years. We took a lot of precautions. So it kind of irks me when people say that I don't know what I'm talking about, or scientists don't know what we're talking about. Time Magazine does, and Facebook does. It just makes no sense at all. If you want to talk about the science from PubMed and the other peer-reviewed sources, I'm happy to. If you want to talk about what you found on Facebook, talk about it to somebody else.
All right, let me talk about some of those.
Well, let me
No.
interrupt. Martin, I'd like to interrupt. I just want to give a chance for maybe anybody else that is attending to ask a question. I know we have Neil, Jan, Jeff, Roger, Chuck. This is a chance for you guys to ask questions too. I don't want you to feel like you can't jump in. Tom, you have a question?
Got a short one, I think, if no one else does.
Please.
So I'm not aware of any really large-scale significant random testing for coronavirus. And in some cases, there are reasons why you don't want to do mass testing because of when specificity and sensitivity are not high, that can result in a lot of real problems. But do you have any insight as to why that doesn't seem to be getting done, or am I just ignorant and it is getting done?
Okay, just to make sure, I know what you're talking about, large scale, sort of like phase 3 type trials being run on the tests?
No, actually random testing for COVID. So to put it simply, why aren't we testing every 10th person every other week randomly? Just to really understand how prevalent it is, what the real incidence of symptom-free cases are, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep, now I see what you're saying. Basically, the reason for that is just partially supply. You have to produce enough assays for it. And partially the logistics of actually doing it. If I want to test, 1 out of every 100 people in this country, that's millions and millions of people. There's no logistical system. There's no laboratory capacity. There's not the personnel capacity to do all of that. If you go look at want ads, I've noticed this recently, they have want ads for people who will be COVID-19 screeners. And they'll basically teach you the basic technique for getting the swabs from people, and then out you go. And that's how much they need people. Contact tracing personnel, they don't have enough. Laboratories to process the test, they don't have enough. There are a lot of things going on to try to get that up to snuff, but at the moment it's mostly a game of numbers and logistics.
Yeah, so even a random 10,000 every week or other week would be beyond the capacity.
Actually, we've got quite a bit more than that. I got to look up the number. I know that we're getting millions per month. I'm pretty sure we're getting millions per week. You may have heard a while ago the epidemiologist saying, if we really wanted to track this baby fully, we'd need about 5 million tests a day. I don't think we're going to get there at all.
Thank you.
Okay, does anybody else that has not asked a question? I want to make sure and give everybody a chance.
Just a quickie there. Are the tests performed like around the different spots in Denver and around the whole wide world? Are they going into a common database to say, here's all the hundreds and thousands of people that have been tested, negative and positive?
There are a couple of different databases. Johns Hopkins University has one. The CDC has one. The NIH has one. I'm sure there are other places. Personally, I like the Johns Hopkins best because they've got personnel expertise, the information technology people. They've really got the best setup. And if you look at the Worldometer data, The data for the US comes from all three of those sources, but when I go and look at them individually, Johns Hopkins reflects that the most. And again, Johns Hopkins works hard to pull every piece of data it can from everywhere to give its numbers. So did that answer your question?
Okay, anybody else that has not asked a question?
I have a question. Um, the issue about the masks and the effectiveness of the masks, and that some are better than others. I think that's a good point. And you know, what are the regulations right now for masks that you can buy, and should there be more restrictions, you know, in place to make sure the masks are effective? And some people make their own masks, maybe out of a thin material. You know, it's, I mean, any mask will stop it somewhat, you know, slow it down anyway. So I don't know if you could address that issue.
Yep. Okay, so let me make sure I understand. Basically, you're talking about the different kind of mask. Is there any sort of basically guidelines for what works best for it? Is that what you're after?
Yeah. And how
Okay.
do you enforce something like that? And, you know, build, you know, more effective,
Yep.
you know, ways to make people wear better masks.
I think what's being done, a lot of the old standard masks like the N95, the ones you see as surgical masks, I used to wear something like that in the lab. They're designed to be highly effective. But there is guidance being put out, largely by the CDC, on the best way to get at least reasonable protection without having to go buy a surgical mask. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned these little double-sided things. A lot of the scarves and stuff that were sold early on aren't that highly effective. These double-layered material things are much more effective. And as time goes by, the guidance is getting to be better known by the medical personnel and by just us, you know, regular people who are out there, and by the companies who are producing these masks. So from what I've seen, just like looking around at the stores, they're producing more effective masks now. And I think part of that is just due to guidance from places like the CDC and people just kind of getting used to it and understanding what's most effective. So they go looking for better masks. So just a little advertisement. If you can find double layered masks, so get this guy out. If you can find double layered masks, and I can't get this one to open, there. Those, and the material on this is some of the fairly smooth material, kind of like maybe a nylon or something. Those tend to have the smaller pores, and the virus will still get through those pores. But the other thing with small pores is that they're easy to clog up with a bit of your the moisture from your breath. So my opinion, double layer, sort of smooth nylon-like material is probably your best bet in the world of cloth masks. So, did that answer well enough for you, please?
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else that has not asked a question? Okay, we'll open it up to anybody that wants to ask a question, more free form. So go ahead and jump in. Anybody, or are we done?
Okay.
Did I scare Martin and Ryan into not saying anything?
Okay, Ryan's got his hand up.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, you don't. Let's get that straight. Nobody here scares the Viking, all right? Nobody.
You're right.
Okay. I'm sort of I'm Ryan the polite Viking. I should put that here.
I'll worry if you take your shirt off and start yelling, then it's time to worry.
Yeah, I know. Cheryl might lose control. Anyway, so Okay, so during the call, I didn't want this to become a political discussion, and thanks very much. But politics is an important part of this, and we have an election that's coming up. I'm going to express and I'm going to note that this idea came from my very conservative family. For those of you who don't know, I'm that one child that, I don't know, maybe there was a comet spraying cosmic radiation over the planet when I was in utero. I don't look or act like any of my family. Let's just say that. Okay, this idea came from my elder brother, John. He's 62, works in the construction industry outside Houston. And yeah, if you cut him, he'd probably bleed little triplets. Okay. Yeah, that's what I get to deal with. Okay, so if I come onto a call and I'm pretty grumpy, that's why. Okay, these are my family. Okay, so the political side is after the elections and representatives have secured their positions for another 2 years. State judges, state governors, the president have secured their job for 4 years, and senators have secured their job for 6 years. Now, John thinks the dialogue is going to massively change to look at the damage that we've done to the economy. Look at these hospitals. Cypress Hospital, just north of Houston, it's about an 80-bed hospital, small relative to some of the bigger hospitals in Texas. And overall, but they closed it over financial concerns. They just couldn't get the elective procedures, which is their bread and butter, done. So they closed down. He thinks that the dialogue is going to massively change, and that's going to really endanger the health of the people that all the data seems to indicate are the ones that are most vulnerable to the most devastating effects of this virus. What would you say? We'll just suppose that what he's saying is true. What would you say are the best ways for people who are in the most at-risk groups to protect themselves? And would that include just not opening the schools at all? Because we do have multi-generational households where, someone in their 60s or 70s may live with their children who are in their 30s, who have children who are in second and third grade. And we all know what little virus vectors kids are, those of us who are parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not that we don't love them, they're cute, but damn, they're infectious.
Yeah. They haven't worked out the germ theory disease as much as, we've had more practice. So anyway, I thoroughly agree that once the election is over and everybody kind of knows where they belong, you may have some quick actions during the lame duck conference period. But once that's over and the new people are in, I agree. It's probably going to settle into a much more economic discussion. I can hope that the people who actually know what they're talking about can balance that a bit, because this whole thing is a balancing act. How do we not destroy people's lives, careers, bank accounts, while still protecting it? That pendulum's going to swing. It's never going to settle where it needs to. So yeah, I agree. There's going to be a lot more financial discussion going on. One of the things I do think has come out of this that could very well help is a lot more people are now working from home. And I think a lot of them are getting to like that. They like to talk with your office buddies, but, working from home's got a lot of advantages. When your commute is basically from your bedroom to your kitchen, it's awesome. So I think we're going to see a lot of that stay in place, which will be good for, future epidemics. The schools, they have been forced to start doing distance teaching. that's been possible for quite a number of years, just nobody wants to do it. Now we've been forced, the structures are going to be in place. And I heard somebody saying the other day that especially for special needs people who either travel is difficult or they're very vulnerable, this could be a wonderful change. So I think we're going to see some long-term changes. I think we're going to see some discussion of the economy that may lose sight of protecting us from the disease. Exactly where it's going to go, your guess is as good as mine. Hope that addressed your question fairly sufficiently.
Well, yeah, it did. And, I want to take every precaution I can to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. There's some hard choices that are, going to be made. I mean, I'm a work from home software engineer. Even before COVID, I love my, 150-foot commute. It was great. Get up, go make myself some coffee, come back to my desk. My desk is in the office, which is at the opposite side of the sunroom from my bedroom. I love it. I feel like my software developer privilege has been, grossly invaded by all the rest of you people getting to work from home too. That's the way it is. But yeah, that I want everyone to know is really important to me. And that I think is a message that we as Boulder atheists, Jefferson County humanists, good folks here should be putting out to our politicians and people that are making the decisions like, yeah, okay, well, we understand that you're going to have to reopen the economy at some point, but, look at key points that are most likely to have the greatest effect, and that'd be, keeping these schools closed and build some more schools. Okay. One thing is, hey, social distancing. Kindergarten through ninth grade, I spent in a school that was, less than 1,000 students in 13 grades. Then I went to a public school in Arlington, Texas, and my graduating class was almost 900 people. Yeah, a little hard to do social distancing. So let's build some more schools, maybe increase student-to-teacher ratios and enable them to actually have some kind of social distancing, which you just damn well cannot have if you're cramming, 3,000 kids every 50 minutes, as they're changing classes. Just not possible. It's like practicing social distancing in, lower Manhattan. Good luck. All right.
Maybe you could give them a rule that I came up with a rule a while ago, which is that if I hold out my arm and you hold yours out, we can't quite touch fingers. That's about 6 feet. We could go with the antisocial thing, which is if yours and mine don't quite connect, we're good.
Was that for me, Mike? Was that for me?
It was purely as an example. Purely an example. One other thing, just
You're
one
a
other
good
thing
guy.
from
I
what.
like you very much.
Thank you. I will send you a beer through Amazon. I don't know.
I would like
But-
that. What's your favorite brew, Mike?
Ooh. I think the Scottish ale that's made by, God, I can't remember who it is. It's one of the Scottish. No, it's made by one of our local breweries, actually.
Oh, okay.
But it's been a while. Anyway,
Yeah,
that's probably my favorite.
Yeah, Pedicolis in Fort Worth took, I think, Great Scott got that's the name of it, took awards in the Great American Beer Festival 3 years running. And I'm discovering, or was discovering, very good beers up here, but yeah, that's awesome. Okay. Hey, this is a great presentation.
Chuck, were you going to say something?
Back,
Well, yeah, I'm just a
I get
word
back
on
to
the,
just one thing real quickly, because what Ryan said reminded me. If there's a message I would really love people to get solid in their heads, it's that slide where I showed how the virus gets into everybody very quickly. All this isolation, mask, social distancing, testing, everything it's all based on the principle that it's not just about me, it's about everybody. And if I have the virus and a lot of us go have a physical meeting at a library, I'm not showing any concern about you guys. I'm also not showing any kind of concern about perhaps your parents who might be 80 years old. All I got to do is give this bug to Cheryl, and she goes and sees some old person she knows. She gives it to them, and you've got somebody who can get deathly ill. So I'm not only, I have to not only think of you guys, I have to think of the people that you guys go to. So I'm thinking everybody else's grandparents. And if we could think that way consistently and worry 2 or 3 steps of passage out, I think it'd help us to see the importance of what we're doing.
110%. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Chuck, you need to jump in.
Yeah, I just worry about the new world order of working from home. I managed a few people that worked from home and they were wonderful. They enjoyed their job. I enjoyed my job when I worked. I haven't been out for 10 years, but I'm just worried a little bit. There's a whole lot of folks who don't enjoy their job. And when they can work from home and try to report in, I've already read a couple of people's incidental studies, whatever, saying that they're taking 4-day weeks very often. They don't walk much on Friday or Monday. And it's going to be difficult, I think, to get people incentivized to work from home if they, in their careers, have really kind of needed the guidance of a manager. That isn't
I agree. I agree to a certain extent.
The way the world's going.
Yeah,
This
I
little thing
agree to
called webcam.
I agree to a considerable extent with what Chuck said, but I think as we get used to it, if I'm working at home and you are my manager, you can be right on top of me, which is just going to be like this instead of you hovering over my desk. And if you want me to do something or do it different, or if I'm not being productive enough, your face is going to pop up on my computer screen saying, Mike, get your ass in gear or you'll be staying home doing nothing for another reason. So I think management can be done at a distance like that. And I think the more we get used to it, the more I will be thinking, hey, my manager, Chuck, can check in on me anytime. He could even have a screen like this with multiple people on it, looking at 8 or 10 of us working and go, looks like Jan's just kind of taking a nap, you know? That's when he gets his little button out that, you know, okay, sets it to Jan, pushes the button.
And he says, hey, I'm out.
So I think as we work at home and do distance learning and all those things, we will get more used to it. And, you know, it's just one of those cases. If you practice something, you tend to get better at it. You just don't do so well the day you start.
Okay, so we're getting close to 5 o'clock. Martin, you've asked to have a few words. If you can just make sure and make it short so we don't go too much over 5.
I'll make it short. First of all, I have here an article which describes a study about correlation of infections or mortality to lockdown policy. The article says, first of all, it looked at it compared 10 American states. The article says, quote, as hard as the lockdown fanatics looked, there was no correlation of infections or mortality to lockdown policy. In other words, it made no difference whether there was a strict lockdown or no lockdown. The numbers were all over the place from state to state. There was simply no correlation. As far as science can tell, lockdowns don't do a damn thing. Another thing which also supports this is that the latest country which has received reporting because of its lockdown policy is Peru. Peru has the strictest lockdown policy in the world. It also has the highest coronavirus death rate in the world in spite of its lockdown policy. The lockdown policies simply do not work.
What about
Okay,
New
so
Zealand?
quick question. That article, where was it from? I can't remember if you said. Like Time Magazine or what's its source? It just,
The article comes from a company called Argonaut Capital in the UK. It's in multiple parts, and it's advising investors on how to invest in things in order to profit from the coronavirus scandal, or
okay,
coronavirus hysteria, whatever you want to call it. Okay.
okay.
Then
If you
Can
Well,
I finish up?
Martin, can you let Mike respond?
oh, okay.
With links like that,
Shall
you
I
know,
tell
there's
you
the
what
thing
the
where you
actual
can,
what the actual paper was? Because I can do that if you want.
You can put it
well,
in the
what I
chat
was,
box.
yes, either in the chat box or just because I don't have to catch it right now. You know, you can message individuals from the website. You know, just click on my name and say send a message. That's a great way for me to get it, and then it's in the message, and you know it won't get lost.
Yeah, you can send a
So
message to all the attendees through Meetup.
yes,
Yes.
Oh, I
so
wasn't
if you would
aware of that.
send
Okay.
me the link of these articles, I will be happy to pull them up. And I know a lot of them will reference actual academic or research studies. So those may be linked out of
Okay.
your article too. So I can sort of chase things down. And I think Ryan might have had a few too. So
Also, can you,
anything that you've got
Definitely.
information, I'm
Definitely.
sort of like Martin here, he's obviously, you know, he's like an information sponge. I
You're
am
right.
too. So if you've got something, please send it. I would like to see it and, you know, chase down the links out of it if I can. So please message me through the meetup. And
Okay.
if you do and you send it to it, you can be assured that I will pull it up at some point and go through it.
Okay. Secondly, there is no consistent evidence that masks work. There have been a large number
There
of
is.
studies done. There have been a large number
I
of studies
disagree.
done, and the results have been all over the place. Some of them
No,
claim
they
they
haven't.
do work. Some
You're
of them
wrong,
claim they
Martin.
don't.
Sorry.
I
He's
can send
wrong.
I'm
you
sorry,
links to
but
those too.
okay, here's the thing.
Thirdly,
Would you
Hey,
like,
thirdly,
if you
Martin,
wound up,
Martin,
can I get through my list before we run out of time?
Martin, I need to end the meeting. So I asked you to make it quick.
I'm
Thank
trying
you.
to.
You can continue messaging all the attendees of this event through meetup.com, and we will get all the links that you would like to share. So I would like to end the meeting. Thank you, Mike, for presenting. It was a very informative presentation. And thank you, everybody, for attending.
and
Thanks,
thanks
Mike.
for all your
Hey, this is a
questions and
great,
input.
it's a great
Bye, everybody.
presentation, Mike. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and Martin, if you want to talk more at some point,